sold out within an hour.
Yeah.
And I'm just like,
Yeah,
quickly did that. By the time I heard that, it would have already had sold out.
Right, so are we all back? I think.
Yeah. If you could figure out what
Okay, so I was, as Marsha was speaking, I was thinking that we're going to have a very interesting discussion before lunch. So we'll have to think or keep in mind whatever she said in relation to what we're going to hear now with the three presentations. So I'm going to be introducing the CIDOC-CRM in a little bit more detail now, so that then Eleni can talk about the backbone thesaurus, which is based on the CIDOC-CRM, and then John is going to talk about the bioportal, which is another project that is doing some of the things that I think we want to do, but we'll discuss all that. Okay, so yesterday I mentioned this method, as it were, to integrate different data sets from different databases through abstract entities, and I introduced the idea of the ontology and the identifier being one abstract entity that appears in the ontology, and this was the definition from the Wikipedia page for the ontology. One thing I wanted to bring up is this. So again, yesterday I talked about the St. Catherine's project and the book survey and so on. So imagine this is the book in reality, yeah? So what we did for that project, and what people do, is they pick up the real thing and they analyze it. They build a sort of an understanding of what the thing is in their mind. So that's the understanding of reality, yeah? And then they express that understanding into a survey form, and they fill in this survey form, and then they try to make conclusions about reality based on the survey form. And this is at least 2 steps away from reality, yeah? So if we consider this our view of the world, and we try to make queries, and results come back and they don't make sense, it's because they are 2 steps afar from the actual world. So what we do is we go back and we repeat that to improve our view of the world. And that process has happened for many years from this group of people, and they are collectively characterized from the longest acronym of this workshop. It's the ICOM CIDOC-CRM SIG, yeah? So people know what these things are. That's a special interest group for the CIDOC-CRM. And that group has been improving the view of the world in cultural heritage in our domain for years and years. So this is a relatively stable model. It doesn't change very often, this ontology. So we are reasonably confident that it reflects reality. But maybe it doesn't. And certainly in conservation, there hasn't been so much discussion about the CIDOC-CRM. But anyway, this is what it is. That's the website, and lots of resources up here. And if I was to introduce some basic sort of concepts around the CRM, I would choose to say the following. So this is the hierarchy of classes that I showed you yesterday. Remember when we tried to figure out what a book would be in that hierarchy. And this can tell us more things. It's divided up here into 2 big branches. The top branch is corresponds to what in philosophy people call the perdurance. Yeah? So these are changes, like events and processes. This is the actual change. They're described in classes up here. So I gave the example of me playing football. Yeah? That isn't something that I can capture with a snapshot of a camera. I need a video camera to capture me playing football. Yeah? So typically things that can be captured with a video camera live up here, and things that can be captured with a photographic camera, with a still camera, live down here. And these are what we call the endurance. So things that are relatively stable. In conservation, we know very well that nothing is stable and objects change all the time. But when you have a painting which deteriorates very, very slowly, yes, that is change, but the painting itself still maintains its own identity. It's still the same thing. Things that we can take a photo and capture them in their totality are the endurance. So that's a big distinction. Another big distinction is between physical things. So these are things that exist and they have a sort of three-dimensional. They occupy space in our world. Yeah, like people, animals, and objects, and so on. So the difference between physical things and the conceptual things that only occupy space in my mind, yeah? Ideas that I hold in my brain. So that's another big distinction between classes in the CIDOC-CRM. So the division is somewhere around here. If I move on to a little bit more detail, we have from the physical things, we have objects, things like that I can sort of pick up, and it's got a boundary that I can define, and features which cannot exist on their own. They have to live on objects. So the typical example I use is the button on my shirt is an object, whereas the buttonhole, which requires the fabric around it, is a feature. And again, in conservation, these are critical things to distinguish here. I mean, I could go on, there are lots of different things, and we'll see a few more classes later on, but I always think that these are the main things one needs to remember about the CRM. And this is the basic structure. So you've got the idea of the activity of the event in the middle, and to this, everything else is linked. In conservation, and I say that nearly every time I speak about the CRM, in conservation, we create records of objects, which isn't really very good practice. We should be creating records of events, and then the objects would link to them. Typical examples are, what is a meaningless question is what is the date of the object? And that thing doesn't exist. The object doesn't have a date yet. The making of the object has a date. The conservation of the object has a date. The moving of the object to something else, to another place, has a date. But the object itself doesn't make sense to say that it has a date. And so once we start building structures around events and activities, then suddenly everything else falls into place. And if you notice, we've got people, entities that have the mental capacity to act independently. We have things, objects in our collections, we have places, and we have durations of time, and all of these things link to activities and events. And these are typically things that people want to search with. So it's a good model. two important things in the CRM are these two classes, the type and the name. These apply to pretty much everything in the CRM. In conservation and in museum studies in general, having a lot of the records that we produce are classifications of things. So we have types of components of objects. We have materials, which is a kind of type. Many of the statements we make in conservation are around classification of things. So the type is a very useful thing. It can apply to everything, and it takes, can describe a large percentage of the statements. The name is another interesting thing, and in historical research and in many cases in conservation as well, things change names over the centuries. So if you're in the study of how things have evolved and names have changed, you cannot confuse the thing with the name of the thing. And I think Masha mentioned that yesterday in one of the presentations. Yeah? So the CRM makes that distinction very, very clear. I'm one entity, my name is a separate entity, and they cannot be confused. One question that came up yesterday, I think Joe asked that, was this idea of the relationship between properties and classes. So I will explain that now. So this was the path that we followed yesterday to figure out what a book is, and we ended up in E22 man-made object. And let's see the definition for this thing. Okay, so this class comprises physical objects purposely created by human activity. Yeah, so not any physical objects, but those that have been created. So we're not talking about rocks that follow the mountain, or we're talking about things that we have made. And the man-made object doesn't have any properties, but that's okay, because the man-made object is a child of the physical man-made thing, and the definition of this thing is slightly different. It says, this class comprises all persistent physical items that are purposely created by human activity. How is that different to the man-made object? Well, this class comprises man-made objects, such as swords and so on, and man-made features, and the distinction between object and feature appears here, yeah? Such as rock art. I cannot lift rock art from the rock, yeah? It's part of the rock. So the physical man-made thing is both man-made objects and other things. And this one has got two properties. And these properties help us make statements about what is shown on the object. So the idea is, of course, that the man-made object inherits these properties from the parent object, the parent class. And we can go on. So we have yet another grandparent now, and this has got a lot more properties. And so these, a couple of them are very useful. The material, how we can specify the material of things, the condition, state of things, or owners, and so on. And these are again inherited, and it goes on and on up to the top of the hierarchy, which, like I said, has got the P1 is identified by, this links to the name, so everything can have a name in the CRM, and the type, P2 has type, everything can have a type. And so the class man-made object appeared as if it didn't have any properties, but actually it inherits everything else from the parent. So it becomes, quite a useful, this inheritance becomes quite a useful tool. Okay, so now I'm going to just highlight a few of these classes that, if I'm correct, are the ones that Eleni are going to talk about as well in a minute. So I'm not going to spend too much time on these. But the first one is the event here. So this class comprises changes of states in cultural, social, physical systems, regardless of scale, yeah? Brought about by a series of, or group of coherent physical, cultural, technological, or legal phenomena. And these changes of state affect persistent items, things, yeah, or subclasses. So the language for the CRM is very strange, and it takes years before you begin to feel comfortable with it. What I can say from my experience and being relatively new working with the CRM is that nothing is random. There's always a reason why this language has been chosen. And you sit in endless meetings with that group of people and you argue every single word. So it's not random, there is a reason. And there is no easy way to get familiar with this language. It just happens because you work with it again and again and again. But you can do a lot without having to argue or explain every single word. So the properties for the event is the link to the participant of an event, an actually a group of people or one person, and what other things were around when this event was happening. The activity is a little bit more specific than the event, and you will see that it has a few more classes over here. A few more properties. The activity is slightly different because it has been intentionally carried out by somebody here. It wasn't an earthquake, it was me doing something on purpose. Activity is a very useful thing for conservation because it's a superclass of all these things. In conservation, we're basically talking about modification of things. So modification is a type of activity, and that modification could be either the production of a new thing or adding or removing things from objects. Conservation, it turns out that that's all we do. We either add or remove things from objects. Yeah. So these two classes are actually quite useful. Type. So this is the class that helps us link the CRM with the various thesauri. In the presentation that Masha just gave, she mentioned that the CRM could be like the umbrella structure, and then you hook from that structure thesauri underneath. So these lists could be considered as small vocabularies, control vocabularies, as examples of type. And you will see here that there is one property that basically is almost identical, if not, it is identical to the SCOS broader term that I mentioned yesterday. So the CRM is sort of replicating that property over there. Material is a type, again, and it's specific for materials. It's obviously many records in conservation and museum catalogs are about materials. Condition state, that is again particularly relevant for conservation, and it's been there from the early days because it's E3. It's one of the early classes as they were included in the beginning of the CRM. There hasn't been enough discussion about this. To my mind, I still don't understand what condition state is in the CRM. And I'm sort of using it because it's there, but I think we might discover in the next workshop that this isn't actually good enough, or not in the right place maybe. So that's the conceptual object. Non-material, products of our minds, only ideas in my head. And that's, again, I think one of the big hierarchies that Elena is going to talk about. Design procedure is important for conservation. This basically describes different techniques. When we have a sequence of actions that we may take to achieve a result, and it's the same sequence for every object that we're using, then we can use that that class. So techniques are mostly described with that. Okay, I mean I can go on. There's a lot there, but these are some that I picked up as particularly relevant. Right. So the CRM is quite a generic ontology and has this range of classes. Not surprisingly, people want to talk about more things than what the CRM covers. And the CRM covers pretty much everything. There's always been a space where things can hang from the CRM. But in order to make the project manageable, you don't want to start adding more and more subclasses and more subclasses to make it a massive sort of ontology. You want to have it sort of bare at the top so that you can manage it, keep it generic. So the structure here is that you have that basic structure of the CRM, but you can extend it. So you hook to one of the classes, that's the bottom of the tree, as it were, and from that you can build new classes and make them more specific. So all of these things are based on the CRM, and they're extensions for particular fields. I think in conservation, there will be arguments for all sorts of things, but in conservation, we probably should focus on the CRM side and the CRM SOC, or SOS, as some people say. So the CRM side is an extension that deals specific with observations and things like sampling and measurements, which is very much the business in conservation. So many of the classes that appear in here may be relevant, and the CRM SOC has an important aspect in it, which is this model for plans. Yeah? So when conservators put together treatment proposals, which are things that do not deal with the past, they're things that may or may not happen in the future. We need a separate sort of model to express all that. So that's in the CRM SOC. Okay, so this is the introduction to the CRM. I was asked, I can't remember which discussion it was, but I think it was a discussion with Masha, to include a couple of sort of different subjects, yeah, so this is plus one. Some extra properties around scores, which are related to aligning thesauri. So all this bridging idea, how that could happen with scores. And I've only got one slide for this, and this is, I just thought I'll bring an example. So yesterday we discussed the preferred label, the alternative label, broader term, and scope note and things like that describe concepts within one thesaurus. These can be used to describe the relationship of concepts across different thesauri. So I've got an example from the AAT and how we could align some terms with the language of bindings thesaurus. So what AAT calls end leaves isn't, I mean, it doesn't exist really in the language of bindings thesaurus as an end leaves label, but we call it separate end leaves, yeah? And again, it's not exactly the same concept, so I've marked that as a close match. The exercise involves looking at the scope notes from the two different thesauri for the terms, and understanding if the concept that each describes is the same or different, and how they're different. So in my view, these two are not exactly the same thing, they're slightly different. So that's one link. This one, the fly leaves from the AAT and the free end leaves in the language of bindings are an exact match. I believe that this is exactly the same thing we're talking about. The base downs in the language of bindings, these are the leaves that are kept with the board when you open a book. So in language and bindings, we have two types of base downs. We have base downs as features of leaves and separate base downs. And the base downs that are described in the AAT include both of these things, yeah? So they are broader to that. And I was a little bit skeptical. I wasn't sure that I would put broader for this over here, so I just put related much. So it's just the different semantics that these properties have, and it shows you that for something seemingly simple like end leaves or paste downs in a book, it still takes a good half an hour of understanding what it is that you're talking about before you can start making these statements. But anyway, this was just an idea of how the mechanics of matching could work once we decide how we want to align the different vocabularies. So that's all I had to say for this part. Are there any questions about the CRM or these cost properties?
These two extensions which you mentioned,
yes,
are they already approved by CRM SIG group?
Their development has been approved, so it's official that we're doing them, but they're nowhere near the maturity of the main model, so there's a long way ahead.
And even SI is more complete than SOC. And even SI is more complete than SOC.
Yes, I mean, yes, that's true. This has just started. Yeah, this is very early days. This is a little bit more mature. I think there are a couple of projects that have used it, and Joe wants to try it as well. So
There is some other ontology related to rights, right?
to
Rights.
so that will be part of this. The rights of things, and there is a model proposed, and that's going to be discussed next week. Rights, relationships, and plans are all in the CRM social.
If someone hasn't used CRM before, two things that often cause oddities to your brain and thus stop you wanting to go any further is how to define actual time. So if you want to put a real date on something, that can be a bit weird, but it can be done. So just sort of say that there are methodologies for doing that, but it's not immediately obvious when you look at the examples. The other one is the notion of roles. The CRM is based on triples, the idea of something, property, something. The difficulty is if you want to say that a person participated in an event in the role of a conservator, that's not a straight triple. That's more you want to do a triple off the property as opposed to. So there are certain things which, based on the technology of RDF, are hard to do, but don't see them as something missing in the CRM. That's just to do with the structure of how your brain works with information. So the CRM is quite a flexible thing, but there are certain things that are not easy to do with it, but they are possible.
Yeah, I mean these are RDF limitations, not CRM limitations.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
But it's for me, I remember, and for a lot of people sort of talked about it, they come up against these limitations and thus stop and think the CRM is not going to be able to do the job because, but actually it can do the job, it's just those complexities are limitations of the RDF.
Of the technology rather than the conceptual model. Yeah, no, absolutely.
And are we going to discuss on technical group approaches how to solve this?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in London, the next workshop will be very much looking at examples of models of data structures and conservation, and giving recommendations of how they can be mapped. Yeah. But anyway, I mean, I think the introduction for today was just enough for Eleni to be able to present the backbone thesaurus, so that when the top terms come up, they don't look unfamiliar.
your next meeting will be about the models, right?
Yeah.
So the linked art model will be discussed.
Yeah, so Rob is going to be there as well. Yeah, yeah.
So the linked art model is only the necessary ones. That's one, and then enough. It's very interesting as an application profile for real possible use. There's a few templates they have also.
Yeah, yeah. So those of you who attended the webinar, Rob presented the basic idea around linked art project, and I think there's a model that works there. So we may as well extend it.
And we've been using CRM Side to sort of look at instrumentation and scientific techniques, but again, as Joe said, looking at the temple component has been a bit challenging. And also working closely with Rob, we're trying to follow what they're doing in LinkedIn, so like do what can work with that, actually.
I mean, that experience will be very useful.
And just to add to that, the link.org for the Archers project with our DISCO project, specifically for conservation science, the link.org will probably form the basis for that model for conservation science.
I have a question. So, CIDOC-CRM, the way I understand this, is this event-based structure of representing the data. How compatible is it with a system like Wikidata that does not have that underlying structure?
Okay, my view isn't perhaps, my view is only my view, yeah. I think that there are very different things. I mean, Wikidata has this capacity to produce properties, to be able to describe all sorts of things. It is a little bit messy. So you have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of properties. There is no coordination or curation there to say, okay, do we really need a new property for this, or are we talking about the same thing? Joe isn't allowed to speak here. The CRM has been developed in a very different way. Yeah? I mean, the Wikidata is very much a community thing, but the CRM, the development of the CRM was very, very different. And that constant discussion over a period of 20, 30 years has got to a point where we can now more or less prove that we don't really need more than 50, 60 properties to do our job. It's more than 60 anyway. So in theory, you could create all the CRM properties in Wikidata, and then you can use Wikidata. But the big difference in my view is that with the CRM, you can develop a tool and you can take advantage of these 50, 60 properties. With the Wikidata, it's a lot more dispersed and anarchic. Okay, Joe, tell me now.
I was just going to sort of say roughly what you just said there, is that you could intellectually define anything you want. And as an intellectual exercise, that can be quite good fun. But to actually use this practically for linked data, you need to create software. So to create software, you need some consensus over how you do things. So if you have hundreds and hundreds of properties, there's no way to search for the same thing or for the meaning. You actually have to have that consensus. And which is why what the linked art sort of project is doing is creating a practical implementation of the CRM.
Even slimming it down even further.
It's to work out that actually if I'm then doing a search for conservation reference in a piece of software, I need it to have that consistency to be able to run the search. So that's the purpose of it. So to have more and more properties is fun to define my own personal data, but then it defeats the point of having the ontology in the first place, to have that regular constructed consensus so that you can actually build software on.
Yeah, so with Wikidata, basically what happens is that you bring together more and more properties. If more projects come on board, they might, bring more properties in. And there's no enough argument and discussion to really justify the use of new properties.
No, I mean, I understand that
Yeah.
there's like some kind of, call it anarchy going on in Wikidata. My question is more, would you as a cultural institution, going with this maybe more academic system, box yourself in a way if you decide to go with that structure that is then so event-based, that you then cannot send all your data out to Wikidata where you may want to participate because it's where maybe the public discussion is happening.
Oh, you can.
Oh, you can. So it's not
Yeah.
that you're then.
No, absolutely.
And I think some of the high discussions at Wikidata is realizing this craziness and looking to actual authoritative sources. So, we've linked to some with a caveat of, we know that this source is relevant, but others are not. So I think you don't box in, but you can link out to those so that you participate in those.
You start getting into the idea of artificial intelligence and machine processing to look at meaning in Wikidata. So it's an extremely useful resource, and you may actually link your data to say, I'm talking about trees, and there's a definition of trees in Wikidata. But the connection you would use would be different. And the information you may get from connecting to all of the properties related to trees could be useful and interesting, but it wouldn't be as automatic, I think is the issue, unless you're lucky.
And then I have a second question. So you were describing that book that you would then link to a certain class, correct? And is there only one class you can apply to your object?
Absolutely.
There's
not.
several ones.
No, in fact, in the CRM, there's a concept called the multiple instantiation. Yeah, so you can make a thing belonging to more than one classes. Now, you cannot make a book belonging to two classes that are mutually exclusive. Yeah, so you cannot say that a book is both a conceptual object, an idea in my mind, and a physical thing.
See, that was actually my question, because we have artworks in our collection that are conceptual artworks. That they are a concept, but they also have, physical instantiation when you install them.
Yeah, so they're physical things, and then they're not also something else. There's a separate thing, the idea, that has an identity of its own. So you have the idea, you give it an identifier, and that idea manifested in a physical thing, you give it another identifier. So you don't have one thing, you have two things there. This is modeling, yeah? This is a modeling question.
This is FRPRO, this is the top left corner. This is have model for this.
Yeah, so the FRBR is and then you will explain that better.
Oh, never, never. Touch that thing.
You have three layers there. You have the conceptual thing, so the idea of the author before it manifested. Then you have the symbolic level, which is the text, but not any specific implementation of the text in the book, but just the idea of what the symbols mean. And then you have the actual thing that's in your library that carries that thing.
Is that meant to copy the frame, or is that aligned perfectly with the frame, or casually?
I'm
What
not
are they,
sure.
items, works, and instances?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It might be. Yeah, I mean, I would be
Very
surprised.
close.
Yeah, I mean, this is designed for biographical records.
But if you have a remodel now, it's changed to ARM
Yes.
and integrated all three
Yeah.
models, and much better in terms of identify things and separated from how they are called, and
Yeah.
also addressing the relationship. It's
Yeah.
still a conceptual model only. That's it.
Yeah,
I think a good example for that is you could have Stanford University is a legal entity, but it's also a physical institution. So you could actually have multiple classes against the same concept. And that's for an institution to be a physical building and a place and a legal entity. It's the easiest way to have three for the same object, as it were.
With the EFLA model, library applications are different. They are the subject oriented. So this book, no matter how many versions, how many things, in which library, it's a work. It's just different expression, different manifestation, different. However, in the museum community is very different. Even the draft of Van Gogh is a work itself, no matter how many versions, each of them is a work. So they are different orientation. I don't know how well that in the future will be mapped again. It's quite different.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of discussion in the SIG now on how to align the LRM model with the.
I think the other thing, complexity of using the CRM that came up when I was looking at it a long time ago was that the man-made object, the E22, the next one down the line is an information carrier. And I think that was initially the idea of having like a CD or a cassette. It was a physical object that held information.
Yeah.
But if you think about something like the Mona Lisa, the image of the Mona Lisa is used in so many different sort of contexts that it is an information object, the actual image. So the painting itself is an information carrier because it's a physical object and it carries the original image that you're talking about. But the requirement to go to an E84 information carrier is based on, do you want to talk about the concept or do you just want to talk about the physical thing? So the notion is that if you're using the CRM, you go as far down the line as you really need to actually define the properties that you care about. And you only go further down to increase the complexity if you really need them to describe the properties. Because you can do some serious navel gazing with it if you really want to.
And yeah, I think the information object is actually being removed.
I'm not surprised, it's weird.
It is removed.
The information object, no, the physical carrier, I think. Well, the carrier, no, information object is still on. It's
Not
not.
information
So
object.
E84 is going, is it?
E84, I haven't seen it in a while. Maybe it's gone already. I don't know.